In the previous video, we looked at situations where either the demand has shifted or the supply has shifted, keeping the other constant. Now let's see what happens to the market equilibrium when both demand and supply change simultaneously. So for the rest of this session, we'll talk about changes in both supply and demand and its impact on the equilibrium state. So let's take the first case. As you can see, I have the supply curve, the demand curve, and the original market equilibrium. Now suppose the supply drops. So I shift the supply curve towards the left. At the same time, the demand also drops. So I would have to shift the demand curve also towards the left. So here I have a new point of intersection between demand and supply. The market equilibrium has changed. So let me try to get the equilibrium quantity and equilibrium price in this case. It's very evident that the equilibrium quantity has shifted towards the left, which means that the equilibrium quantity has reduced. But what about the equilibrium price? In this case, you can see that there is a slight decrease in equilibrium price, but the decrease is not very significant. And also notice that the decrease in price could also be because of the way I have drawn the graph. Suppose I draw my graph in a slightly different way. Now look at this. So again, you can see the supply curve, the demand curve, and the initial equilibrium state. I try to repeat the same scenario. So here the supply has decreased. So let me shift the supply curve towards the left. Also, demand has decreased. So let me shift the demand curve towards the left. And now let's try to get the equilibrium quantity and the equilibrium price. So what has happened? Consistent with what we saw earlier, the equilibrium quantity has shifted towards the left, indicating a reduction. But what about the equilibrium price? It's almost the same. I do not see any shift in the equilibrium price. And this is not consistent with what we saw in the earlier slide, where we saw a slight reduction in the equilibrium price. So to put things together, I can conclude that in any case, when both supply and demand drop, its impact on the equilibrium quantity is very clear, because whichever way I draw my graph, I can see a clear reduction in the equilibrium quantity. But the impact on equilibrium price is ambiguous. In fact, it depends on the extent to which the demand or supply has shifted. So there can be a slight change in equilibrium price or no change at all. Hence, we can say that the impact on price is a question mark. We need to look at the extent of change in supply and demand to analyze its impact on equilibrium price. So let's try to summarize what we saw in this slide. So we are talking about a case when the demand decreases, supply also decreases. So what is the impact here? The equilibrium quantity decreases, but the equilibrium price, we don't know what exactly happens. So let me put this as a question mark. Now let's consider another scenario. So this is the supply curve, the demand curve, and the initial equilibrium state. Now in this case, let's assume that the supply decreases. So shift the supply curve towards the left. But demand increases. So shift the demand curve to the right. And now try to get the new equilibrium state. So what is the impact here? Price for sure has increased, but I do not see any major change in the quantity. So again, the extent of change in quantity depends on the extent of change in demand and supply. So in this case, we saw that the demand increases, supply decreases. So the impact is equilibrium quantity is a question mark. We do not know exactly by how much it will change. but equilibrium price has increased. The change in equilibrium quantity depends on the extent of change in demand and supply. Moving on to the next case. So look at this graph. So this is the supply curve, demand curve, and the initial equilibrium state. Now let's consider an increase in demand. So which means I shift the demand curve towards the right, and an increase in supply. So I shift the supply curve also towards the right, and now try to get the new equilibrium state. So what do I observe here? Quantity for sure has increased. So the quantity has increased here. But I see a very negligible impact on price. So let's try to put this together. In this case, we saw that supply has increased, demand has increased. So what is the impact? Equilibrium quantity has increased, but we do not know much about the equilibrium price. So let me put this as a question mark. And finally, we move on to the last scenario. So this is the supply curve, the demand curve, and the initial equilibrium state. Now let's assume that supply has increased. So shift the supply curve towards the right. Demand has decreased. So shift the demand curve towards the left. So now what is the impact? Let me try to get the new equilibrium state. So you can see that quantity is ambiguous. So we do not actually know by how much the equilibrium quantity will change, but clearly we see a drop in price. So which means in this case we saw supply has increased, demand has decreased. We do not know what is the impact on equilibrium quantity, but we have seen that the equilibrium price has decreased. So let's put together what we learned in this video. So this is what we have seen in this video. Do not try to memorize this table. You can always draw the graph and check the impact of each scenario and then try to get the equilibrium quantity and equilibrium price.